Dr. Alison Broinowski is a visiting fellow at ANU and UNSW and a senior research fellow at the University of Wollongong, where she collaborated in an ARC-funded project on Asian Australian fiction, the results of which appeared as a set of 10 papers in Antipodes in June 2011. She was formerly an Australian diplomat, and she has written and edited 11 books about the interface between Australia and Asia and Australia's role in world affairs.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all coming along to hear me again after a really long time. It's so nice to be back among the politics and the pub people. And I must say, you couldn't have timed your topic better this time. I mean, exquisite timing. You guys must know something that the rest of us don't about how to get something that's really up to the moment. Because today they have pushed through the Parliament the last of 3 bills, each of which was equally rushed through without proper consultation or even proper drafting or circulation of the papers to the Parliament before they could scrutinise them, think about them and vote upon them. In decent haste, you might say, 3 bills. The first one gives ASIO powers to access your computer networks. It gives people, it gives its own agents immunities to conduct special intelligence operations, SIOs, so-called. It makes it an offence to disclose that those operations have taken place if you happen to know about them, and you can get 10 years for even saying to a journalist, or for a journalist to even write, that such an operation is known to them. And there is no public interest defence. So this is pretty strong stuff. That's the first one. Second one, these first 2 happened last year. The current one has just happened now. Second one is the Foreign Fighters Bill, which you're all familiar with. And it makes it an offence to travel to a quote, declared area, as well as to advocate terrorism. That means that's very wide, by the way. And it expands the control orders that the government can place on people and the preventative detention regimes on any citizen they virtually wish, who falls into their very broad category. Thirdly, and this is today's heft, this is the Data Retention Bill. And the Data Retention Bill requires all the telcos, large and small as far as I know, Steve, to retain all of their customers' metadata for 2 years. Now don't be deceived, they've been retaining them for quite a long time and giving them to all kinds of business people. That's why all of a sudden, if you order a theatre ticket, you suddenly get a whole lot of advertisements for theatre tickets, don't you? This data has been sold on and used for a long, long time. But now what the government is doing is formally requiring the telcos to store it for 2 years. And this will have a cost, don't forget. It will cost them to store it. Who do you think is going to pay the cost? The government says they will find part of the cost. The rest of the cost will be for us, won't it? So, in fact, all of the cost will be for us, the citizens, because in the first place, if the government funds it, it's through your taxes. And of course, they're not going to raise any new taxes, like hell. And secondly, it'll be a further new tax on us to pay telcos to keep this metadata. So in fact, what's happening is we own the data. The telcos take it. The government buys it from them. We pay the telcos first for our telecommunications service, then we pay the government to collect it, and then we pay them to pay the telcos to keep it. I mean, no new taxes? Think about it. Metadata. As I said, they've been collecting it for years and years. The only thing that is wrong about this is what Tony Abbott said, or was reported this morning as having said, which is that it was no problem for him when he was a journalist. They did it all the time. No, they didn't. There weren't any metadata when Tony Abbott was a journalist. He didn't know what they were any more than George Brandis, when first asked, knew what they were. I mean, these people hold your life in their hands. It's seriously worrying. I mean, it'd be comical if it wasn't so funny, it's so serious. However, ever since we've had, I mean, the precursors of metadata, yes, telephone intercepts and all that stuff, they've been doing for donkey's years. But the metadata are, in fact, the raw material of investigation, the building blocks of investigation, as David Irvin went around describing them last year. The only difference that's happening now is that they admit what they've been doing. They admit that now it's a lot easier to get, and that there's a whole lot more of it. And so the law that is going through today simply formalises the status quo. There's nothing particularly new about it, and there's also nothing particularly alarming about it. I'll come back to that. And also, I'm going to suggest at the very end that they want us to be afraid, and I'm going to suggest why we shouldn't be. So, there's been a lot of protest in the media about metadata invigilation on the grounds of press freedom, which doesn't exist in Australia. It's not in the Constitution, it's not in any law. It's a tradition, but it is certainly not guaranteed by the government. And they say that because they're afraid that it will deter people from giving them stories. Now, some of those people might be whistleblowers. Some of them might be nuts. Some of them might be in parliamentarians' offices, mightn't they? Which is a little bit of a worry, you might think. So the government now says that they won't collect journalists' metadata, but how in the world are they going to decide who a journalist is? And how in the world are they going to say, oh no, wait a minute, we're not going to look at that one. That's coming in to a journalist. And when the journalist replies to this whistleblower, they're going to say, oh no, we're not going to look at the person it's going to, because that person is a journalist's source and therefore protect. Forget it. Can you imagine that happening? No way. It is clearly fanciful. And as always, they are throwing us some little crumb of comfort for idiots who don't know what is really going on. The only thing you can be totally certain about in all of this is that they will seriously protect what goes in and out of their own offices. How is an interesting question. And I don't know the answer to that, but just keep your eye open for how they're going to do that. So, government can and has, for many, many years, hacked our phones and invigilated our email, as long as we've had email. And they always say that it's for national security. They don't ever tell us what they've got or what success rate they have with what they've collected. All we know from watching is the record, which has been one pretty much of regular stuff-ups. I'll come back to that too. So you've got government, you've got the media, and now you've got citizens. Now, the media hack, as we very well know. Government hacks, which is in fact what they call invigilation of our data. They are hacking us all the time. When the media do it, as in London with the News of the World, when they're found out, they get into some trouble. But in fact, citizens, when we do it, oh wow, that's treason. That's conspiracy. That's hanging crimes. And it's all about shelving the blame for the very things that these authorities do onto ordinary citizens, against whom these things are done. And there's a growing cohort of these people living in various places in the world, in various situations of discomfort, like, for instance, Julian Assange, Alan Kessing, the guy who leaked about the customs regime in Perth, Bradley Chelsea Manning, who's in jail for 30 odd years, Edward Snowden, who's stuck in Moscow, Glenn Greenwald, who can't really live in London again and prefers to live in Argentina, Sarah Harrison, who's stuck in Germany because she helped Edward Snowden get out of Hong Kong, James Risen, a former New York Times journalist who's written a couple of very revealing books about all this, and an American Treasury official called Diane Rourke, who, a number of these people have formed a group which go around the world giving awards to people, the Sam Adams Award, which is given to people who defy the authorities in the invigilation of data. They mostly have pretty unpleasant lives after they've done it, but they're extremely courageous people, and I recommend you just follow what these people are doing. It's really interesting. Anyway, coming back to Julian. Julian and his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, have put forward the argument that, I must say, when I first heard it, I had to sit back and think for a minute. It was so new to me that I had to go, wow, what is this? The argument is that citizens' private information is their own, but government's information is collected at citizens' expense, and therefore it belongs to citizens too. And the government does not have a right to keep it from citizens, while the government also has no right to get into the private information but that belongs to citizens. Now when you think of this, and here we are in the year of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, which, had there been an internet, would have said similar things in those days. And here we are, in effect, undermining some of the most fundamental principles of privacy of citizens and the limitations on the rights of those appointed to government. Government says all the time, in its own justification, that its surveillance of all of us is intended to protect us against mainly two things: terrorism and lately cybercrime. And when terrorism lost its sort of frightening power, they trotted out cybercrime, because that's pretty frightening too, if you think about it. But a couple of years ago, I was in Washington at a conference, and there was a man there who's often comes to Australia. He's a guest at the Lowy Institute, quite frequently. And he had been in the National Security Agency, and he wasn't anymore, but his little joke, he was talking about national security, and his little joke was, why do we have the NSA? Because the NSA frightens people into going on paying for the NSA. I wrote it down. I've never forgotten it. And it resonates, because it's exactly what they do. They have to find things to frighten us with. And it's pretty easy to put the frighteners on people when they're either ignorant or poorly informed. And by God, we are poorly informed a lot of the time, because a lot of the things we need to know, we are not allowed to know, or our media don't bother to find them for us and tell us. So, my questions about national security are, if it's so important, why have they been so secretive about doing all this for so long? Why is it that they only started to come clean about metadata collection and internet invigilation when, first of all, WikiLeaks revealed it, and then Edward Snowden's revelations proved it. And then all of a sudden, they had to come out of it. Even then, the head of NSA lied to the Congress. In front of all of the Congress, he lied and said, no, they didn't wittingly connect anything. I mean, it's such a habit of lying that they can barely shed it, even now that they realize that they have to. What's the consequence of this for Americans? I'll come to us in a minute. Americans, I've seen in recent articles about this, are so afraid of having their names put on the list, that they actively circumscribe themselves in what they search for on the internet, in what they write, in what they print, and what they say. Because if you use certain words, or if you correspond with certain people quite innocently, you can find your name on the list. And the list has 1.2 million Americans on it. And they're there because, for some reason or another, they may possibly be a person of interest to the National Security Agency or the FBI. And you can imagine the effect that this has on the spontaneity of people who write, people who research, people who try to report facts, let alone think, speculate, wonder about anything, let alone correspond with people in other countries. Because what the NSA can do is it can surveil metadata in the United States, just as we are proposing to do, but it's not allowed to do it beyond the rules of the FSA court, which are pretty liberal, I have to say. But the NSA can surveil any foreigner, anybody outside the United States, or anybody who is not an American citizen. There's a problem about how they know if someone's an American citizen when they're living abroad, but that'll leave that to one side. But all of us and all of our stuff at any moment can be invigilated by the NSA. Anytime, and for whatever reason, and be put to whatever purpose they like. And the only constraint that's imposed upon the NSA by the court is in relation to American citizens. So there we are. The thing about covert operations in government is that they're totally unaccountable. And apart from that court, which has almost never turned anything down, they can and do literally get away with murder. And that's the trouble with surveillance and so-called intelligence authorities. Some people think we need them in order to deter crime and to find people who need to be caught, and so on. But does that justify the kinds of risks we're exposing all of ourselves to? Don't forget what Australia's first act of terrorism was. Anyone remember? The Hilton bombing, 1978, right? In which for which no person has properly been found guilty. Poor Tim Anderson went to jail for years and years and was pardoned and found not guilty. And several people died or were injured as a result of that. And the trail leads very clearly to the intelligence authorities and the police. And that's why we've never been able to follow that trail to where it should lead, which is a real worry. And if that's how Australia deals with terrorism, then we've got to lift our game. ASIO too, of course, like NSA, has watch lists that people ought perhaps to be worried about getting on it, given their record of errors in the past and virtual McCarthyism in the anti-communist days, about which Frank Morehouse has written and Meredith Bergman lately, including here at this pub, I think. She and her friends met and talked about that. Terrorism today, you see, is the new communism. And the technique, as I said before, is first of all to frighten us about something, terrorism, communism, and then to say, never mind, you're afraid, but we're here to look after you. We reassure you, we'll take care of you and look after you. But they sent out 800 police on a nighttime raid, remember? In Sydney late last year, and made one arrest, just one. And they didn't even have the killer of Martin Place, Martin Morris, on a watch list. I mean, you have to really be confident in these people and their record being able to look after us, don't you? What's more worrying about ASIO is that we aren't allowed to know. There's an awful lot that we aren't allowed to know. It's a crime to reveal the identity of an ASIO officer, to to reveal what a secret intelligence operation may be about. As I said before, people can be held, if they do these things, or if they're of interest to ASIO, people can be held for several days without access to a lawyer and without being able to tell their families where the hell they are, or what they're doing, or what's happening to them. Their computers can and have been trashed, and they have to sign orders saying they will not reveal this to people. Some people have courageously revealed it since. These raids have been without warrant, and even applying for warrants, if that goes through the legislation, could well become just a formality, as it does inside the United States. ASIO as well has members sitting on the board of the National Archives, where they very closely monitor what goes into the archives and what does not. Frank Morehouse says that nothing from ASIO goes into the archives at all. I'm not sure whether that's right. He says it, but however, they certainly make sure that very little does. And the latest annual report of ASIO is so hugely redacted that when it comes to operations, there's nothing there. It's all blanked out. You're supposed to see operations and successes, or operations and achievements, or something like that, and there's nothing there. So thanks for that. That's where we get our assurance that they're looking after us.
Sorry.
So why do they need all these new powers? They haven't even used the powers that they've been given since 2001, and they've been given heaps. We were told that these powers were out of date, and given the new age of terror, they had to be given lots and lots. So they were. They reversed the onus of proof and the presumption of innocence. Here I am, 800 years since Magna Carta, and that's gone or going. And yet, says Anne Summers in the Herald the other day, the threat of terrorism is less than the danger of falling out of bed. She was quoting the Australian Institute of Criminology, and she also pointed out that women are being killed in Australia at an alarming rate, that illegal guns are everywhere, and that we don't seem to pay nearly as much attention to that as the possibility that one person out of 800 may turn out to have some sort of terrorist plot. So if we are so afraid of terrorists returning from being psyched up somewhere in the Middle East, why in the world do we not consider making life chances better for them before they go, giving them some hope in being an Australian, giving them some opportunity to get a decent education and a decent job, and maybe better than all of those things, which may not entirely work, not go to unnecessary illegal wars in Muslim countries, which is one of the main reasons, and this has been observed all over the world, one of the main reasons why Muslims leave their countries to go to war is to defend their fellow Muslims where they are being attacked by foreigners, which is exactly what we are doing. So if we didn't do that, imagine how many people would not be radicalised. How many Australians would not be radicalised. Okay, now I think I've probably taken more of my time than I should, and I'll skip a few things, but quickly say that what we are now confronting, and this has been observed in America too, all of this stuff we ditto from the United States, is something called the deep state. Now, the deep state's been written by a Canadian called Peter Dale Scott, and he's really worth looking up. The deep state is its own self-governed community that operates on another level altogether from the elected government. The elected government knows it's there and has no control of it. It goes on when the elected government changes, and it remains in its own community, together with its equivalents in other countries, particularly the Five Eyes partners in the agreement between the Anglo allies, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And what they do is they trawl for all of this information. They store it in enormous databases, in enormous installations, one of which is just being completed in Utah, and another one a little bit smaller in Canberra, all matching. and all sending each other stuff that they collect, because when one state is not allowed by its own law to collect certain things about its own citizens, they rely on the others to do it. They do it, then they swap. And this is how it operates. And this means that anything at all can be known within that circle, within that group of 5, to any government at any time. And the deep state, which has no trust in the government of the day, goes on doing it, and their aim is to collect everything. Everything they can, whether it has a purpose or not. Like in the same way that Google wants all the books, right? Just like that. Everything. All the telecommunications. And Snowden says, don't kid yourself, metadata is a smokescreen. They can collect the whole lot. And at any time, by bypassing their own laws and using the others, they can get the content of your communications without any trouble at all. Do not be deceived about that. So here we are, and here's my quick conclusion. Are we to be frightened about all this? Are we to sit with one eye looking over our shoulder when we're typing something? And if we put the word bomb in an email, we go, oh shit, I can't write that. Somebody will be onto me. Well, yes, they might. But if we are scared, then they have won. Their aim is to scare us. Their aim is to make us afraid to do things. And we are the many, and they are the few. And they know that. And they're very, very few. And while they may have a lot of power, if everybody says, we aren't afraid, and I mentioned some people who have courageously done that, but if we all say, we will not be cowed in this way, we will damn well write what we like, and say what we like, and print what we like, then what can they do? They'll be overwhelmed. And here is the wonderful thing that happened the other day. Mr. Brandes, the great expert on metadata, had his email absolutely flooded and trashed by a group that decided to copy every email that they sent was copied to George Brandes. Whatever it was about. Are you going to pick the kids up? Copy George Brandes. and this is a wonderful, I mean, Australia has a supine record in these matters, as I've described, but this is a wonderful small Australian invention that does exactly the kind of thing that I recommend. And if we refuse to be afraid, if we refuse to go to unnecessary wars, and if we refuse to let them tell us that these wars are about terrorism because it's a lie, then we may get somewhere. And quite frankly, if the mainstream media fall in a heap, we all have other ways of getting the news out to each other. Thanks for listening.